What if death doesn't take everyone to the same place? What if the moment your body stops breathing, you don't simply disappear? And you don't immediately arrive at some single destination called heaven or hell? What if there are 4 different places waiting for the dead? Thousands of years ago, the Book of Enoch described something almost impossible to imagine. Enoch says he was taken to a mysterious mountain in the west. But this wasn't an ordinary mountain. Inside it were 4 enormous chambers. Deep chambers. Dark chambers. Places hidden from the living. And according to the angel Raphael, these weren't tombs. They were places where the spirits of the dead were being kept while they waited for judgment. But here's what makes the account so disturbing. The 4 places weren't all the same. One was associated with the righteous. Others were connected to people who had died under very different circumstances. And one of the spirits Enoch encounters belongs to a man whose story is known by almost everyone who has ever read Genesis. Abel. The first murdered human being in the biblical story. And Enoch says Abel's spirit is still crying out. Still waiting. Still connected to the injustice that happened to him. That means something enormous is happening in Enoch's vision. Death hasn't erased the record of your life. The body can disappear. The grave can be forgotten. Centuries can pass. But according to this ancient text, something about you remains. And by the end of this investigation, you'll understand what Enoch says happens to the dead in these 4 places, why the righteous are separated from the wicked, why one chamber is connected to people who were murdered, and what eventually happens when the appointed day of judgment arrives. But there's something even stranger. Because Enoch doesn't simply describe where the dead wait. He describes why they are separated in the first place. And that means the question isn't simply, where do you go when you die? It's, what determines where you go? And Enoch's answer begins inside that terrifying mountain. Enoch is standing before the mountain when the angel Raphael begins explaining what he's seeing. Inside the mountain are 4 hollow places. But they aren't simply 4 rooms filled with random souls. Each chamber has a purpose. And the first one Enoch is shown is completely different from the others. It is bright. There is water there. A fountain. And the spirits inside it are associated with the righteous dead. In the ancient description, they are separated from the others and experience relief while awaiting the final judgment. That detail is easy to overlook. Because Enoch isn't describing the righteous as simply floating somewhere in the clouds. They're waiting. Waiting for something. Waiting for the appointed day. Waiting for the final judgment. And that raises a strange question. If these people are already considered righteous, why aren't they simply in their final destination? Why are they waiting? Because Enoch's vision seems to divide death into stages. There is what happens immediately after death. And there is what happens after the final judgment. Those are not necessarily the same thing. The 4 chambers appear to be part of that waiting period. And that means the popular idea that everyone instantly arrives at their final eternal destination may not fit neatly with Enoch's vision. The righteous have a place of comfort. But they're still waiting. The wicked have places of distress. But they're still waiting too. And one of the most fascinating things about this first chamber is the imagery. Light. Water. Rest. The contrast is deliberate. Because elsewhere in Enoch, darkness, chains, and torment become associated with those who rejected righteousness. The ancient author is creating a separation between 2 groups long before the final judgment is completed. And then Enoch encounters something that makes the entire vision personal. A voice. A cry. A spirit that has not forgotten what happened to him. Abel. The man whose brother murdered him. His body has been gone for generations. But his injustice has not disappeared. And Raphael's explanation reveals something enormous about the Enochic understanding of death. The dead may be separated from the living, but they are not forgotten. Their stories remain. Their deeds remain. And their judgment is still coming. But Abel isn't the only kind of dead Enoch encounters. Because the next chamber contains people who died with something completely different hanging over them. Guilt. People who committed wrong during their lives. And escaped punishment before they died. They thought death ended the case. According to Enoch, it didn't. And what Raphael tells Enoch about those people is where this ancient vision becomes genuinely unsettling. Now Enoch is shown another group of the dead. These aren't people who died as innocent victims. They are people who did wrong during their lives and escaped punishment. They lived. They committed their deeds. And then they died without ever being held accountable by human beings. But according to Raphael, death didn't erase what they had done. Their spirits remain in a place of distress while they await the appointed judgment. The idea is remarkably simple. Getting away with something in this life doesn't mean the case is closed. A person might deceive everyone around them. They might accumulate wealth through injustice. They might hurt someone and never face consequences. They might die peacefully while everyone remembers them as successful. But Enoch presents death as the moment when the illusion of escape disappears. The human court may have failed. The family may never have known the truth. The evidence may have vanished. But the record remains. And this is one of the most important themes running through Enoch's description of the dead. Death does not erase accountability. The grave isn't a hiding place. And the passage doesn't suggest that someone's physical burial determines which chamber receives their spirit. The distinction is based on what happened during their life. That means the four chambers aren't really about four different methods of dying. They're about four different conditions of the dead. And that becomes even more obvious when Enoch is shown the next group. Because one chamber is associated with people who were not the perpetrators at all. They were the victims. People who were murdered. People whose lives were taken unjustly. And their spirits are waiting for something very different. They're waiting for justice. Think about Abel again. His body is gone. His murderer has lived on. Generations have passed. But Enoch's vision says Abel's cry has not disappeared. His death is still known. His suffering is still remembered. And his case is still open. That gives the four chambers a completely different meaning. They're not simply ancient versions of heaven and hell. They're more like holding places before the final verdict. The righteous wait in comfort. The wicked wait in distress. The murdered wait for justice. And another group remains in a condition that Enoch describes separately. But there's one detail that makes this even more disturbing. If these spirits are already separated according to their deeds, what happens when the final judgment finally arrives? Because Enoch doesn't leave them in these chambers forever. Eventually, the doors open. And what happens next is where the entire human race is brought before judgment. The next chamber changes the story completely. Because these spirits aren't waiting there because they were wicked. They are there because something was done to them. They were murdered. And Enoch is shown their spirits waiting for the day when their blood will finally be answered for. This is where Abel's story becomes important again. In Genesis, Abel is murdered by his own brother. His body disappears into the ground. But his death doesn't disappear with it. Enoch takes that ancient idea and makes it part of his vision of the afterlife. The murdered dead have a voice. Their suffering remains known. And their case is not forgotten simply because the person who committed the crime managed to escape human justice. Think about how different this is from the way we normally think about death. We often imagine death as the moment when everything stops. The evidence disappears. The victim is gone. The guilty person eventually dies too. And eventually, everyone becomes history. But Enoch presents a completely different picture. Death doesn't close the moral ledger. It preserves it. The victim is still known. The crime is still remembered. And justice is still coming. This is also why the four chambers shouldn't be reduced to a simple ancient version of heaven and hell. Enoch is showing different conditions of the dead while they await something bigger. The righteous have a place of comfort. Those who escaped punishment experience distress. The murdered remain associated with the justice they are owed. And there is still another category waiting in the darkness. But notice something fascinating. None of this is based on whether the person was buried, burned, or lost. Enoch's concern is what happened during the person's life. What they did. What was done to them. And what remains unresolved. That makes the story much more disturbing. Because if Enoch is right, death doesn't give anyone a clean escape. Not the victim. Not the criminal. Not the person who thought nobody would ever discover what they had done. Eventually, every unresolved case reaches the same destination. Judgment. And that's when the story leaves the mountain. Because Enoch is eventually shown something much larger than four chambers. He sees the moment when the dead are no longer simply waiting. They are summoned. The judge takes his place. The records are opened. And suddenly, nothing that happened during a person's life remains hidden. But before we reach that final judgment, there's one more chamber we have to understand. Because the fourth group is unlike the others. And what Enoch says about them is one of the strangest details in the entire vision. The fourth chamber is where Enoch's vision becomes especially difficult to interpret. Unlike the bright place associated with the righteous, this chamber is connected with another group of the dead who are waiting for their judgment. They aren't simply erased. They aren't forgotten. And they aren't released from accountability because their physical lives have ended. They remain in the realm of the dead until the appointed time. This is important because Enoch's vision isn't presenting death as one single destination. It is presenting death as a waiting period. A temporary separation. The righteous wait. The wicked wait. Those who suffered injustice wait. And eventually, the waiting ends. The final judgment begins. That's the pattern running through the entire vision. And it explains something that can easily be missed when people read Enoch's description of the afterlife. The four chambers aren't necessarily the final destinations. They're places where the dead are kept until something greater happens. The final verdict has not yet been delivered. And that means the most terrifying part of Enoch's vision isn't actually what happens inside the mountain. It's what happens after the dead leave it. Because once the appointed time arrives, Enoch describes a judgment in which the righteous and the wicked are separated. The dead are no longer simply waiting. They are brought before the judge. And the deeds of their lives become the basis of what happens next. This also gives us an important perspective on the question we've been exploring throughout this story. What actually determines a person's fate? Enoch doesn't point us toward the condition of the corpse. He doesn't tell us that an intact body receives one destiny while a destroyed body receives another. Instead, the emphasis remains on righteousness, wickedness, injustice, and judgment. The body eventually returns to the earth. But the story of the person continues. And that is perhaps the most unsettling message hidden inside these four chambers. You can bury a body. You can lose it. You can destroy it. But according to Enoch, you cannot bury what you did with your life. Every action eventually becomes part of the record. Every injustice remains known. Every righteous deed remains remembered. And every person eventually reaches the moment when the waiting ends. But here's where the story takes a dramatic turn. Because Enoch doesn't just tell us that judgment is coming. He is shown what the judgment looks like. And when the throne appears, the dead are no longer hidden inside four chambers. The entire system of the afterlife opens before Enoch's eyes. And what he sees next is the part that ancient readers would have found truly terrifying. For what may have felt like an eternity, the dead have been waiting. The righteous. The wicked. The murderer. Those whose lives were never properly judged. All separated. All waiting. But Enoch says the waiting does not continue forever. There is an appointed time when the entire arrangement changes. And this is where the Book of Enoch moves from the places of the dead to the judgment of the dead. The chosen one appears. A throne is established. And the dead are no longer simply spirits waiting in hidden chambers. They are brought into the presence of judgment. This is important because Enoch's vision doesn't end with death. Death is the waiting room. Judgment is the destination. And the difference between those two things changes the way we should understand everything Enoch has shown us so far. The righteous weren't simply waiting for nothing. The victims weren't crying out into an empty universe. And the wicked weren't suffering without purpose. They were waiting for a verdict that had not yet been delivered. And when that moment arrives, Enoch describes the righteous being separated from those who rejected righteousness. The elect one sits in judgment. The deeds of humanity are exposed. And those who thought they had escaped accountability discover that death never actually erased their case. But there is something even more fascinating here. Enoch's vision doesn't portray the righteous as simply escaping into some distant spiritual realm. In chapter 51, the earth itself gives back what it has received, and the dead are restored as part of the final order of things. The earth that received the dead. Give them back. And that means the four chambers were never meant to be the end. They were temporary. The dead were waiting for something. And now that something has arrived. But there's a question hiding inside all of this that most people never ask. If the righteous and wicked are separated before the final judgment, what exactly happens to them when judgment is finally pronounced? Because Enoch doesn't describe one universal outcome. He describes two radically different futures. For one group, light, restoration, and life. For the other, fire. And when Enoch describes that fire, he isn't talking about a funeral. He's describing a punishment that comes after judgment. Which means the most frightening fire in the Book of Enoch isn't the fire that consumes a body. It's the fire that follows a verdict. And that takes us directly into the final stage of Enoch's vision. The moment the judge separates the righteous from everyone else. Now the waiting is over. The righteous have been separated. The wicked have been identified. The spirits that waited in the hidden chambers are no longer simply waiting for an unknown future. Judgment has begun. And Enoch describes something that makes this moment far more frightening than simply standing before a judge. The record is opened. The Book of Enoch repeatedly presents judgment as an examination of what was done while people were alive. In chapter 61, the elect one is placed upon the throne of glory, and the text says that deeds are weighed in the balance. Think about that. Not reputation. Not wealth. Not status. Not what people thought you were. Your deeds. The things you actually did. And Enoch makes the judgment personal. The hidden ways of people are examined. The righteous are recognized. Those who oppressed others are exposed. And the people who believed death had ended their story discovered that death was only the beginning of accounting. This is where the four chambers suddenly make sense. They were never the final destination. They were waiting places. The righteous were waiting for vindication. The murderers were waiting for justice. The wicked were waiting for judgment. And now the judge arrives. But here's something even stranger. Enoch's vision doesn't end with the wicked simply being punished. It describes the righteous being raised from the earth and clothed with what the text calls garments of life. The people who were once dead are alive again. The people who waited in darkness are brought into light. And the people who suffered injustice finally see the moral order restored. That means the four chambers were only the beginning of the story. Death separated humanity. The waiting chambers preserved that separation. But judgment makes the separation permanent. And this raises a question that is almost impossible to avoid. What happens to the people who thought they had escaped judgment simply because they died? Because Enoch has an answer. And it's not comforting. The wicked aren't forgotten. They aren't released because enough time has passed. And they aren't protected by the fact that their physical bodies have already disappeared. The judgment reaches them anyway. But then Enoch shows us something else. Something that makes the fate of the righteous look completely different. Because after the judgment, they don't simply return to the world they left behind. They receive something the dead have been waiting for from the beginning. And when Enoch describes what they're given, the four chambers suddenly seem like nothing more than the doorway to something much greater. The righteous are about to enter the world of life. So now we can return to the question that started this entire journey. Where do the dead go? According to Enoch, the answer isn't simply one place. The dead are separated. The righteous are kept apart. Those who suffered injustice remain connected to the justice they are owed. And those who lived wickedly await judgment. But here's the part that changes everything. None of these chambers is the final destination. They are places of waiting. Because Enoch's story doesn't end with the dead remaining inside that mountain. Eventually, the appointed day arrives. And when it does, something extraordinary happens. The earth gives back what was entrusted to it. Sheol gives back what it received. And another realm described in the passage gives back what it owes. Then the elect one appears. He chooses the righteous and holy. He sits upon the throne. And the earth itself begins to rejoice. The righteous are no longer simply waiting for their fate. They are entering the world that comes after judgment. And this is perhaps the biggest revelation in the entire vision. The four chambers were never really the story. They were the beginning of the story. The mountain was not the final destination. It was the waiting place before the judge arrived. And that means the question isn't simply, where does my soul go when I die? Enoch forces us to ask something much harder. What happens when the waiting is over? Because at that point, your life is no longer hidden behind the circumstances of your death. The grave doesn't matter. The passage of centuries doesn't matter. Whether anyone remembers your name doesn't matter. What matters is what the judge finds. And Enoch's mysterious Son of Man is presented as the figure connected with righteousness, hidden things, and judgment. The text says the Lord of Spirits chose him and gave him authority over the powerful and wicked. So the story that began with four dark chambers ends with a throne. The story that began with the dead waiting ends with resurrection. And the story that began with the question, where do they go, ends with a much more frightening question. What will happen when they are called back? Because Enoch doesn't merely describe where the dead wait. He describes a mysterious figure who has been chosen to judge them. And that figure appears in the text before the final judgment ever takes place. Who is he? Why does Enoch call him the Son of Man? Why is he given authority over kings, the powerful, and the wicked? And why does Enoch describe him as revealing things that were hidden? Those questions take us far beyond the four chambers. They take us to one of the most mysterious figures in the entire Book of Enoch. The Son of Man. And that's the story we open next. The Book of Enoch reveals who the Son of Man really is, and why he was chosen before judgment. That's the mystery waiting on the other side of this one. The dead were waiting. The judge arrives. And Enoch says the story was written long before the final day.